Please welcome our next guests for a discussion on what women of color need to know to secure a seat at the table with author Minda Harts, moderated by Alexandra Siegel, Director, Equality, Content, and Enablement, Salesforce.
Right.
Yes. So we are so excited to have you here, Minda. You have a lot of fans here at Salesforce. I want to give a quick shout out to Tia Joseph. She is our president of Salesforce Women's Network. She actually organized a book club to read your book, The Memo. So we're so thrilled to have you here today.
Yes.
And
Thank
today,
you, Tia.
Yes, thank you, Tia. And so today is our second annual Gender Equality Summit, Trailblazing Women. And we talk about gender equality, we often leave out the experiences of women of color.
Yeah.
And you have done such an incredible job to elevate those experiences. What inspired you to do so?
Yeah, I think it's just that. Oftentimes, I spent my career 15 years in corporate and nonprofit roles, and we always talked about women in the workplace, but oftentimes that always meant white women first, and then everybody after. And so that paints a story that is not everyone's experience. And as Sojourner Truth said, ain't I a woman? And so a lot of the statistics always are framed around white women. And so I think gender equality is important, but we also have to talk about racial equity as well, so that we don't miss out on other women.
Absolutely. And I know when many women of color, including myself, saw your book, I think there was a sigh of relief heard across the world. Like, finally, there's a book that talks about my experiences. Why do you think it has taken so long for us to have a book and an honest conversation about the experiences of women of color in the workplace?
Yeah, it's funny. Toni Morrison, she says, write the book you want to read. And I was hoping that somebody else would have written the book, right? Because I put myself out there in a way that sometimes we're not always encouraged to do, to talk about the ugly truths in the workplace as it pertains to women of color. And so it's crazy to think that my book came out in fall of 2019, that it's the first book of its kind by a major publisher. And when my agent went to shop the book around, 4 out of 5 major publishers said, there's no audience for a book like this.
Wow.
And so it almost didn't happen again. And so I think it's so important that we remind companies and organizations and ourselves that our stories and our careers matter. And I found that many of us were leaving corporate America because we weren't seeing ourselves in the C-suite. We weren't seeing ourselves in the career narrative. And so I wanted to remind us that, as Audre Lorde says, beware of feeling like you're not good enough to deserve it. And we deserve it. We've worked really hard for it. So I want companies to allow us to have that seat at the table and secure that seat.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for writing that book for all of us. And so tell us about the person behind the book. Tell us a little bit about your past, your journey to becoming an author.
Yeah, it's so a wild ride. I think, 15 years ago, I graduated college, so now you kind of know my age. But
we won't tell.
We won't, please don't tell. So I graduated with a communications degree, and the only job I could find at the time was an administrative assistant. And I worked that for a couple years and then had the opportunity to pivot into a consulting role, which I spent most of my career in, but I was always the only one. The only woman of color, the only Black woman, and you learn to settle into isolation. You learn to settle into microaggressions. You learn to tell yourself, oh, so-and-so didn't mean any harm, when it does mean harm to us, and it means harm to me. And so I had a good career when I look at it, but I realized that I had to make the workplace better than I found it. And so for me, writing the memo was really important to tell the stories of women of color and Black women, because we often don't get to read about our stories. And it took a lot of courage to get to this point, Allie. When I look back on the Minda in sections and seasons, I was very shy at first, and I wasn't as vocal about some of the things, but I realized if I don't use my place at the table, if I don't talk about some of the inequalities, then who is gonna talk about it for me, right? And so it's funny to see the evolution, the metamorphosis of even myself. And once I realized that it's not just about the career that I've built, but what am I doing to make sure that other women of color feel seen and have the opportunities to?
Absolutely. And, we hear this a lot, and we've heard this even today on the panels, this fear of being seen as angry when you're a woman of color, and that really can silence you.
Yep.
What is your advice to the women of color listening who have that fear and that very real fear? every day.
Yeah, and it's a real fear. I think a lot of times people make jokes about, oh, the angry black woman, the docile Asian, the feisty Latina, but these are tropes that people have placed on us. And so I say two things to it. I say, we don't have to subscribe to that narrative anymore. That is their narrative, that is not ours. And so lean into being who you want to be in the workplace. And if being articulate or being passionate are the things that make you who you are, then we can't do our job and manage someone else's emotions at the same time, right? But the other part of that is making sure that we build networks within our organizations and companies so that when someone tries to call you an angry black anything, someone who maybe is your advocate or your sponsor will say, no, that's not who Minda is because I know her, right? So it's hard for people to vouch for you when they don't know you. And so I think that we can dismantle those ugly stereotypes, which I think are racist as well, because no one else is calling other people that, right? And I often say, if I'm being angry, then as opposed to who, right? Like, give me an example of what that looks like. So I think that we just have to redefine the narrative for ourselves.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this, finding your allies, and you talk a lot about finding your squad.
Yes.
You know, how do you go about finding your squad, your support system in the workplace?
Yeah, well, I think it took me a little while to figure out that while I had my head down working really hard, that there was this other game going on, and that some people were getting to the top not because they worked the hardest or they had the numbers and the stats, but because they knew the right people. And when I entered college as a first generation graduate, low-income family background, I didn't know that I needed to make friends with Bob, right? That wasn't something that I knew. I just thought that my work would speak for itself. And then once I realized that, while I was working hard, Kim knew what Bob's favorite birthday cake was, right? Because she was at the happy hour. She was at the break room birthday parties that I didn't feel like going to, right? And so I realized that I needed to get out of my cube because reality is, as great as I thought I was, nobody was necessarily checking for me, right? Or seeing me as the obvious winner. So I had to go to the karaoke's, right? I needed my Taylor Swift song that I could sing, like I needed these things. And quite frankly, it served two purposes. I was able to see my colleagues in different ways, and they could see me outside of the office. But I could identify who my squad members were and who I could trust inside the workplace, because you're not going to be able to build relationships just passing each other to get sparkling water out of the freezer, you have to really get to know people. And so just like Puff Daddy said, tell your friends to get with my friends and we can be friends. You have to, build a squad. You need to build a network. And once I did identify those people to put on my squad, and it wasn't just my peers, but they were some of them. It was my manager. It was skipping levels of management. It was HR, right? Because they know some of the tea that I don't know. And so it's once I realized that you never know who you might need, right? From the bottom up, from the top down. But I realized that success is not a solo sport. I can't get to the table by myself.
That's what I love about your book, is that you really balance explaining the realities of what it's like to be a woman of color and the difficulties that you face, but at the same time being really honest about looking inward at yourself and what steps you can take to help chart your future. Yeah. And so how do you really balance those two? How do you balance feeling frustrated or defeated at times, but then also looking at the path ahead?
Yeah, I think it was important for me to realize, yes, there is this system in play, and sometimes it can be bias, and there can be a lot of microaggressions or macroaggressions, depending on the day it is. But I think what I realized, what could I control in this situation? And so then I started to kind of shift my focus from, oh, these people are treating me who knows, how bad on certain days, but what could I do to continue to build my dream, build my career? Because quite frankly, many of us walk away from environments because of the pain, right? Because of the aggressions. But what I realized is what's inside my toolkit. So once I started to do some self-reflecting, I said, okay, I'm good at these things, but what could I do to enhance my superhuman powers, right? And one of those things was public speaking. I realized that if I wanted that seat at the table, I'm going to have to use my voice, and not just for myself, but for others. And if I am the only one, then I have to really take accountability for how I'm going to use my voice. And so even before I had a seat at the table, Allie, I invested in myself in that way. I took improv classes, public speaking classes, because I was deathly afraid of doing something like this today, but I knew that I needed it. And so I started to look at what could I do to build my career. And maybe it's not the table that I was at, right? But maybe the future table or the one that I would create. But I knew no matter what I would be doing in the future, I needed that skill. And so I encourage women to figure out, or anyone to figure out what they want and how they build off of those strengths, or what you might perceive as a weakness that you never knew was a strength.
That's super inspiring. I know we were just talking backstage and how I used to be afraid to get on stage as well. And you know, whenever you have a weakness, you can overcome it.
You can.
That's
we are both living proof.
Yes, exactly. Well, let's take a second to talk about microaggressions, because we've been having this conversation in our own company, what defines a microaggression, and we talk about them as these slights or snubs that may be intentional or unintentional, but largely impact underrepresented communities. And we like to say they're like paper cuts. You know, you get one once, not a big deal, but if you get it every single day, it can be truly painful. Can you tell us about your experience with microaggressions?
Oh, how many hours do we have? But I think the thing about microaggressions I think that because of those cuts, right, we start to get used to them. And I think that's the dangerous place, because then we start to say, oh, okay, this is what I have to do. This is what I have to get through. And I feel like as women of color, we don't have to accept those things, right? But we have to realize, and others have to realize, that the onus is on them to change their ways too. And so one thing that I wrote about was this time that my manager had gotten to the car and he noticed that on my nails that day I had burnt orange fingernail polish. And he says, "You people love your bright colors." And then he laughed like it was comedy night at the Apollo, and my colleague in the back seat, he chimed in, and then for the next 15 minutes they talked about how Black people like bright colors.
Wow.
And in that moment, I didn't know what to say, you know, and it's funny because even though that was early in my career, it still hurts.
Yeah.
And there were things that happened later on, and I get emotional every time I talk about that story, because it's those little things that stick to you.
Yeah.
Those cuts, and you don't realize how much pain all of those cuts cause you till later. And I often reflect back, not because that hurt my feelings so much, because I put on armor after that, because that was a good day for him. But what I realized was, I wish that I would have said something to him. Because what happens is we go back to our desk and we play it on a loop over and over and over again. And that does a lot of damage, because now I have to manage that and do the best work I can. And I don't think a lot of our counterparts understand what that's like. Yes, people have a bad day, but sometimes ours is, yes, we've had a bad day, but then it's also these racial aggressions, right? And racial harassment, whether intentioned or unintentioned, is just as insidious as any other form of harassment. And I think it's important that we check language and we allow ourselves to have these courageous conversations. So when it does happen, we give ourselves permission to say something to a colleague. But then on the other side, I need our colleagues to be courageous listeners, so that we create the space to be able to say, you know what, this hurt, or, you know, this was inappropriate. And then it not be, oh, you're being an angry Black woman, right? Because our feelings matter just as anyone else's. And so I do want to see more of those courageous conversations and listening taking place.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about it, you know, you talk about this a lot, that it can be super difficult for others to really understand what we're going through as women of color. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
And, you know, how can we help others understand, and how can we help them understand how to be the best ally to us?
That's a great question. I think that we have to understand that all of us have bias, right? And so no one is woke, right? We all have room for improvement. And I think one of the things that I heard a woman say to me, she happened to be a white woman, and she was passing my book like at a conference, and she didn't know I was the author. And she said, "Oh, that looks like a great book. I wish that I could read it." And in my mind, I thought, you know, this cover, it says for women of color, and it has a woman of color on the cover. But really, our unconscious bias would say that this book is just for you in me. But a book like that is actually for everybody, because if you're a manager, how are you engaging with your diverse talent, right? If you are a colleague, how are you, do you understand what it's like for me to come in on a day after like a Trayvon Martin situation, right? Or, so I think there's all of these different things. So if we want to be allies, it takes action. It takes a little risk. It takes a little more than saying that I'm an ally, but actually having some receipts, right? That are able, that we could, the person that you're benefiting can actually call you an ally. And so I think it's important for our allies to read and educate themselves. And it's okay to have conversations with us, but start with a baseline, right? Read a book like the Memo. Read a book like White Fragility. You know, read a book like So Let's Talk About Race, because then we have a place to have a conversation, right? And I think that we can't be the professor and give you homework. There has to be something that we both get out of the situation. But it starts with us being able to talk about our stories. And for so long, we've been silenced.
And even when you say that, you know, we realize as people of color, we, for our whole lives, have read books written by people that don't look like us. And so asking our allies to do the same, though it may be uncomfortable, is super important. And I hear you quote such amazing women of color authors like Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde. Are these people who inspired you to start writing?
Yes, they absolutely did. Because like you said, we don't always get to read about our stories. You know, how many business books have I written, or have I read, or have you read by white men and women that have great advice, but they're really not talking about my experience. They're not talking about the intersectionality, or if they do, it's like an asterisk. And so I wanted us to be able to have a book where we could shake our heads up and down and say, yeah, you know, I've been there too. But most importantly, knowing that you're not alone, because I think many of us are one of few or one of the only, and you start to think, you start to question your worth, you start to question your value because you don't see yourself in executive roles like your counterparts. And so it can be lonely. And I, again, wanted to write this love letter to us to remind ourselves that we are good enough to deserve it.
And I want to take a second to celebrate you, because you are a best-selling author. You have done something incredible with this book. How does it feel? How does it feel to be on this book tour, to see so many people enjoying the words that you wrote? It's
humbling. It's humbling. You know, I really never wrote this book thinking that maybe just my mom and dad would be the people to buy, you know, if I'm being honest. But I really wanted to, tell our stories, because again, for so long we have silenced ourselves, and it's hard. I'm learning to celebrate the wins, right? And so I thank you for that. But most importantly, I wanted to leave something for the current generation and then future generations, like Audre Lorde left to us, like Toni Morrison left to us. What am I doing to make sure that Black stories don't get erased, that our dreams don't get erased? And so it feels good to have, it feels good to be seen. I wrote a book in which I wanted women and men, or whomever, however you identify, to feel seen, and it feels good to equally be seen.
Yes, I think we all want to be seen. And I hope that, you know, all women of color eventually, and people of color, and everyone can be seen in the workplace.
Yes.
But these are super difficult conversations that we have to have. So what's some advice that you would have navigating these waters as we have these conversations?
Yeah, office politics, it's a real thing. It's as real as, you know, White Walkers on Game of Thrones, right? These are real issues. It's all fine and well till they're running after you, right? You know, it's real life. And I think that, again, when you understand what it's like to be me, to be you, then you have a little more empathy, right? And I think that that's what I hope our counterparts understand, that this is a human thing. This is an equity thing. Don't you want, if we work together day in and day out, don't you want me to thrive in the workplace just like you want yourself to thrive? And as we close that empathy gap, then everybody can win, right? I'm not saying your privilege, you should put it aside. I'm saying, how are you using your privilege to help others who haven't historically been in the room? You can't lean in if you're not in the room. You can't lean in if you're not at the table. And so I think it's hard to have these conversations, but for so long we haven't been having them. So what would it look like, just jumping off the roof and having some of these critical conversations? Because again, if we're not talking about like self-advocacy, I think what was our was a prior panel, finding your voice. We all have our voice. It's how do we want to use it? And so advocating for yourself, you are your biggest advocate. And if your manager is not invested in your success, then it may require you to manage up, right? How can people help you if maybe you haven't articulated your value and quantified your worth? And so even though it's tough, we have to learn to lean into our courage and push aside our caution. And even writing this book, I was hella scared, right, to do it. But I realized that my curiosity was larger than my fear. What could it look like if we actually were having these kind of conversations at Salesforce, at all the other Fortune 500 companies? These are important topics, and if we want to be better leaders, then we have to lean into our fears.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for leaning into your fears.
Thank you.
Yes. And so I want to touch on something you said, because at Salesforce, something we've challenged our community to do is to mentor someone that doesn't look like you, that doesn't identify as you. How are you able to find mentors, and what is the importance of mentors to you?
Yeah, mentors are great. And I think now because of technology, we don't necessarily have to sit down with every person, every mentor, right? We don't have to have a coffee. And I think sometimes or we don't have to slide that paper over formally. Will you be my mentor? Check yes or no. You can actually find so many different mentors online, people that you've never met. There are people that I use as mentors, and I read their books, right? That's a form of mentorship. And I think that if you're interested in doing a certain thing, being in a certain role, being on the stage, follow those people. Get the gems that they're dropping on their Twitter or LinkedIn, because that's mentorship. And so for me, I was able to, because I was one of the only ones in the workplace, I had to seek mentors that didn't look like me. But it was relationship building. All of it really comes down to that relationship piece. And I sought that out. And there was one gentleman, his name was Steve, and I say his name because if it wasn't for him mentoring me, but then eventually sponsoring me, he catapulted my career by leaps and bounds. Like on paper, I probably shouldn't have been in management, but he used his privilege to help me. It didn't take away from him, right? But and then another gentleman by the name of Chuck, and many of my mentors and sponsors have been white men. And they've really helped me along the way. And Chuck, he actually lives in San Francisco. He taught me how to negotiate my salary, right? Here's what you asked for. There is a range. And I think there's so much that people can give that, and we all can benefit from it. So who are you mentoring, and who's your mentor? I think it's how do we reciprocate that? And we all have something to give.
You're so right. And then, similarly to mentors who don't look like you, there's also so much power in community.
Absolutely.
And I've been super fortunate to have some incredible Black women and men like Ebony, who we saw, and Molly, who we'll see later, and Tony Prophet, who also happens to be my boss, who have been such incredible mentors. And they're also in my community. And, we have these organizations here at Salesforce, like Bold Force, which is our Black employee resource group. Talk to me about community. Were you able to find community through all of this? And then even now with the book, I know you have maybe found new community.
I've definitely found new community. And I also want to just shout out to Molly, because the other part of this is women helping women. And there's enough for everybody, right? And I think that when we provide opportunities for each other, we all can shine. And so never shy away from helping another woman secure her seat as well. There's enough room for all of us, but I just wanted to publicly thank her for always being an advocate for me. The beautiful thing about the Memo is it became a bestseller because of community. It was not because I had 1 million followers, quite the opposite. But it was everyday women who saw themselves in the story, and then they told their friend, and they told their community, and then these book clubs started, and then, so I have all of these different women in my community, and what I did because of that, I've been on the road for 6 months, almost nonstop, is I want to invest in that community who invested in me. And so once a month I host, no matter where I'm at, what hotel, what I'm doing, once a month I host a virtual book club, because I want to hear what they're experiencing, what's resonating. And I think, again, success is not a solo sport. And to me, I want to invest in the community as lifelong, not just, here's my first book, thank you, it's been great, but how do we all keep securing our seat? And I'm so fortunate for the new community and tribe members that I meet each and every day.
That's beautiful. I love that. Success is not a solo sport. We need to remember that.
Yes.
So what's next for you, do you think? You put out this incredible body of work. You have sparked conversations that in many cases, we're not having in a public and open and courageous way. So what's next for you, do you think?
Oh, a break. Self-care.
Well-deserved.
Yes. But I'm actually starting to pitch a new book that I'm really excited about that I can't talk too much about yet. But when you think about the body of work, but one aspect I will talk about, and I think it's important for this, is the healing part of it, because many of us, being in my prior life for 15 years, you realize those cuts that you talked about, that's a lot of trauma. That's a lot of workplace trauma. And it's hard to secure your seat, or it's hard to bring your authentic self to work when you've had so much trauma that you may not even realize has been holding you down.
Yes.
And so I'm really exploring what healing before the table looks like.
Yes, I love that, because I think it's super difficult, especially in communities of color, to talk about mental health and to talk about wellness. So, thank you for sharing that and being courageous in that. So let's leave on some empowering notes for the audience. What are some things that we can remember about the power that we all have as women of color, entering the workplace, in our lives? What are some, nuggets that you can leave us with?
Yeah, I think the main thing is letting people know what you want, and don't be afraid to ask for help. I think we are our best advocate, and sometimes certain situations, maybe you've been overlooked for a promotion or a raise, and we forget what we bring to the table. So always remember that you are the prize and that you are the room, right? We often talk about a seat at the table, and it's more than just fixtures. Yeah. It's about ownership. It's about legacy building. And once you realize that you get to recreate your narrative. So I don't know what your narrative was an hour ago, 15 minutes ago, but you get to start today. You get to show up in the workplace the way you want, authentically you, whatever that means, no more by anyone else's standards. And so just remember that you are the room. You don't have to have a title to have influence. We have a sphere of influence in everything that we do. And lastly, remember that it's bigger than you. Everything we do, every time we speak up or we talk out, it's not just for us, but it's for the women of color coming after us, because we don't want them to cry some of the same tears or have some of the heartache that we had. We want to make it better for them. And so remember that it's not just about us, but we can make it better for us too by making it better for them.
Yes, I love that.
Yes.
And so what is your dream when you think about gender equality and racial equality? What does that look like to you?
Where everybody has a piece of the pie, right? You think about equity, and that's making an equitable workplace for all, because one of the things that I think about often is how much of your workplace, how much of their talent do you want to use? There's so many great, talented women of color that we're just not tapping into their potential. And so I don't want them to leave or retire without having used everything they had. And so what are these managers? I'm holding managers accountable, because one of the stats that I wrote in my book was that 70% of women of color feel like their managers are not invested in their success. That's a high number. And so I want to see more of managers invested in the success of women of color, because that number ultimately affects how we get to the C-suite. And so we're not stopping until we get these seats.
Well, thank you so much, Minda. Thank you for reminding us of our power, of our voice, of our responsibility, not just to each other, but to those coming up behind us. And thank you for sharing your courage and your words with us.
And thank you for making it easy for me. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you.